Good morning, everyone. Happy Father's Day. I'm sure there will be some ties, maybe some stocks, maybe some power tools in your future later on today. They keep me away from the power tools. That's not a good idea. I am really looking forward to today's presentation. A reminder that humanism is a rational philosophy informed by science, inspired by art, and motivated by compassion. It advocates the extension of participatory democracy and the expansion of an open society standing for human rights and social justice. Our reader this morning, one of our favorites, she always brings entertainment and thought-provoking readings, Miss Ann Henderson.
I'm going to do two readings, but they're both like a third of a page long. One of them, I didn't know this. If I had a doctorate or something in history, I might have. But this is because of Juneteenth. So I'm telling you about the Emancipation Proclamation. On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln presented the Emancipation Proclamation. The proclamation declared all persons held as slaves within any states or designated part of the state that the people whereof shall be in rebellion against the United States shall be then henceforward and forever free. The Emancipation Proclamation did not free all slaves in the United States. Rather, it declared free only those slaves living in states not under Union control. William Seward, Lincoln's Secretary of State, commented, "We show our sympathy with slavery by emancipating slaves where we cannot reach them and holding them in bondage where we can set them free." Lincoln was fully aware of the irony, but he did not want to antagonize the slave states loyal to the Union by setting their slaves free. The proclamation allowed Black soldiers to fight for the Union, so that was a good thing, soldiers that were desperately needed. It also tied the issue of slavery directly to the war. But it would take the 13th Amendment, ratified in December 1865, that's like 3 years later, to free all the slaves. So I didn't know that. Okay, but now here's a fun one. Unhappy birthday to me. It's important to share, or so I've been taught, to show kindness to others, to be a good sport. But all of those teachings have taken a bump, for I share my birthday with Donald Trump. For years I knew not of this dark, dreadful fate, and with ignorant bliss, I honored the date. But then it got hijacked, sullied, gazumped by a self-serving bigot, a foul gibberlump. With him, I would share an infectious disease, a moldy bread roll, infestations of fleas, a romantic weekend at a toxic waste dump. But please, not my birthday, Mr. Tangerine Chump. Alternative dates he's welcome to try. 12th September, 33rd July, but 14th of June in a lake, take a jump and find a new date, you deranged sewage pump. That was from Brian Brifton.
Thank you, Ann. We gave Donald Trump a one-day early birthday present as a nation. I thought it was fitting.
Yes, that was really good.
This morning, Dr. Kathryn Sampeck will lead us in a discussion of chocolate, the complex history of social, economic, and political impacts on the societies that produce and consume it. Dr. Sampeck is a professor of anthropology at Illinois State University. She earned her bachelor's and master's from the University of Chicago and her PhD from Tulane University. She uses multidisciplinary approaches to investigate a variety of topics, such as taste, cultural landscapes, race, literacy, money, and commerce in American commodities in the early modern world. She has devoted years of archaeological and historical research to the understanding of cultural history of chocolate. Her archaeological endeavors are community-based, including co-directed projects with the Tribal Historic Preservation Office of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. Let's have a rousing ovation from our friendly house audience and a warm yet muted welcome from our Zoom audience for Dr. Kathryn Sampeck.
Thank you so much for that great introduction, Todd. And I also want to thank Joyce and David and the group as a whole for inviting me to talk to you about some of this work that I've been doing for the last few years. So what I'm going to talk about today is sort of an overview of the research that I've been doing over the last many years, but more specifically, at the University of Reading. Right now, I'm in a 4-year position funded by the British Academy as a global professor. And it's basically a chance to deepen and widen the work that I've been doing on this, looking at chocolate as a way to understand basically global changes in social relationships, how we experience the world, things that, and especially I think chocolate's a great example of taking something a bit for granted. And as you delve into its history, you can see all of the processes and events that brought it to us today. And then ways that we can be thoughtful consumers and thoughtful about our environment and the people around us. And so, yeah, I'm especially working on looking at issues of and really deep time, long-term perspectives about sustainability, social inequalities that have been part of chocolate's history for a very, very long time, and the ways that engaging in cocoa farming communities and chocolate consumers can actually become a mode of enlightenment and improvement. So it doesn't have to always carry that heavy, weighty negative connotations. But there are lots of social and ecological challenges associated with chocolate. So what I really think is that of all the kind of common everyday foods that we have today, chocolate's this really unusual intersection of contrasting ideas and contrasting experience. And by that, I mean, how would you describe chocolate? A lot of people say rich, dark, healthy, sinful, sweet, bitter. You know, it's when you line them up, they really are dissonant in many ways. And also, chocolate can be a food, you know, chocolate bars, a beverage like hot chocolate today, a color. But at the same time, and because I think of these really different experiences and ways to understand chocolate, it crosses a lot of culinary borders. It becomes part of people's food culture in many different parts of the world. And those different characteristics today seem like they're intrinsic facts of chocolate. Well, that's just the way it is. That's what chocolate is, and that's how it has to be made, and that's how it has to be produced. But actually, when you look at the history from this deep time perspective and starting at its beginnings and sort of working forward, there was a broad array of flavors, colors, and forms of chocolate. And the colonists, European colonists, chose particular qualities of pre-Columbian chocolate for really specific kind of social, political, and economic reasons that were part of the historical moment. So those legacies of those kind of colonial, specific, historically contingent choices live on today. And in many ways, I feel like have the same effect of pushing the bitter conditions of cacao laborers into the background while crafting a sweet sense of identity through taste. So what I'm going to do is look at the changing role of chocolate by first describing the pre-Columbian world of chocolate, and then how Europeans adopted it through colonization and how those choices directly relate to the current food movement, especially to turn to slow, small batch craft chocolate. So to understand the history of chocolate, I'm not going to begin necessarily at the dawn of time, at the very beginning of its domestication and first uses, though I'll have a little bit of that in its homeland in tropical America. But I'm really going to pay the most attention to the places, uses, and time that had the most to bear on the eventual adoption of chocolate across the world. So characteristics or facets that seem like colonial inventions were instead a kind of appropriation by Europeans who took up this sort of siren call of chocolate in ways that amplified what Mesoamericans, the people of Mexico and Central America, had already been doing. Mesoamericans consumed cacao in simultaneously discordant and complementary ways, and I'll show you some examples of that. And so as a ritual offering, as currency, as flavoring in foods, and as a beverage. The dissonance of these meanings of cacao and chocolate persists today. And in this sense, we experience chocolate as Mesoamericans did hundreds of years ago. The northern Amazonian basin of South America seems to have been the first place where the tree that we get the seed from which we make chocolate was domesticated. So it's a domesticated plant. So we use the seeds and it grows. The cacao tree is an understory tree in a tropical forest. So it does the best in a kind of forested environment. And it has this big fleshy fruit that reminds me a little bit of a papaya. And on the inside, there's a sort of a sweet fruit, fleshy flesh to the fruit, and then these big seeds. So of all the sort of foods that we consume today, cacao, it has one of the biggest seeds, whereas its contrast, vanilla, has some of the tiniest. And then the other thing that cacao, it's has very specific environmental needs as far as it doesn't tolerate cold very well. It grows basically on 32 degrees either side of the equator, but only in sort of lowland tropical regions that have abundant rainfall because it needs water, consistent amounts of water. And all of this helps its ideal environment to flourish. And we get some clues about this through, here's an example. The other thing about cacao is that these are very tiny flowers. They're tiny, complicated orchids that need, there are only a few insects that are the right size to pollinate it. And it has to be pollinated. They're not self-pollinating trees. So it needs that right kind of ecological environment for the pollinators to thrive. And then these pods grow directly from the branches where those flowers form. So any damage to the flower in one year means that no cacao will grow there the next. So it's very sort of finicky, delicate, needs this very specific kind of ecosystem. And we get clues about the ecosystem, both directly and indirectly. And here's an example of an animal that's very, very much associated with cacao in pre-Columbian art, and it's a howler monkey. So what does that tell you? That these people of Mexico and Central America were recognizing that the environment of cacao is also the environment of the howler monkey. And what do howler monkeys need? They need a diverse sort of forest for foraging and for living their lives. And that's also the same kind of environment important for cacao. Plus, howler monkeys love to eat cacao fruit. And so they're very much seen, in today in cacao growing regions is enjoying the fruit, spreading the seeds, doing all that good work to help cacao along. And then the other thing is that an ideal cacao environment is basically kind of incompatible with large cities. And here are a few examples of kind of complex agroforestry and open field farming systems of different indigenous groups in Mexico primarily and parts of Central America. And what it shows is that there's this attention and awareness of needing this kind of diverse cross-section, diversity in the ecosystem, the kinds of trees, where they're grown, the kinds of plants, where they're grown, having the upper story, understory, that sort of thing that would be supportive of a tree like cacao. And to have that, you can't have wide swaths of very dense population. And it's true today that cacao farming is not compatible with big, dense cities. And that's an important point because, and I'll return to that here in just a minute. And direct archaeological records also document residues and the occurrence of cacao with lots of other kinds of plants, and including, I like this example of vanilla because we think of them as sort of opposites, but vanilla vines actually will grow up and coil around the cacao tree. And they both have the same kinds of ecological needs, the same kinds of tiny pollinators work for both plants. And right there, you've got sort of a basic recipe for a really interesting, for the foods and drinks that you're going to be making with them. So what we end up having in this kind of situation that's very specific to cacao is that you might have lots of places where you could grow maybe a small amount of cacao, but to have an extensive, intensive cacao farming agroforestry setting only occurred in a few specific places. So it's not sort of evenly all across Mexico and Central America, but rather particularly in these regions that I've highlighted in this map. And so if you look to the north, there's this what's called the Acalan zone. It's the border between today's state of Campeche and Veracruz. And there's still a lot of cacao that's grown there today, as well as vanilla. And then the other main place, so if you have some familiarity with, say, ancient Maya cities and where they occur, that's sort of in the central region of this map, and that is not an ideal spot for cacao. Some cacao can grow in small amounts, sort of like it'd be enough for ritual purposes or that sort of thing. But if you're consuming a lot in your food and drink, it's not enough. And then there's another use of cacao that I'll talk about also that would require, sort of large amounts circulating and people having access to it. And then you'll see at the bottom of the map along the Pacific coast, there are three other main areas. One of them, Soconusco, which is at the border of Mexico and Guatemala. Another one is Suchitepeque, a little bit farther down the Pacific coast. And then there's this region in Western El Salvador that here I have labeled as Izalcos. And those were the absolute prime producers when Spanish colonists arrived and started recording things in alphabetic writing. And then there's lots of evidence archaeologically and in pre-Columbian texts that these were major producing zones. And then, so out of these regions, it happened that I did field work in that Isalcos region, or what is also the Rio Ceniza Valley. So it was the main homeland of the people who eventually called themselves the Isalcos. And they were by far the premier producers in the 16th and into the 17th century of cacao. And so what I really want to emphasize with this is that cacao could be accessed in small quantities in a lot of places, but cacao for pre-Columbian people of Mexico and Central America, it actually was experienced largely as an export commodity, coming from those four principal places to large areas of Central America and Mexico, where it was absolutely not possible to grow cacao. And like I said, my main area was this region that had the highest sustained productivity despite ravages of colonial violence and extraction, this Rio Ceniza Valley of El Salvador. And then I want to sort of set the stage by thinking about how that cacao was being produced and how it was, the sort of labor system was largely managed. And it shows this, even in pre-Columbian examples, reliance on a certain degree of coerced labor, sometimes through a kind of indentured servitude, and which were really sort of set patterns for the present day labor conditions in cacao and chocolate. And, you know, especially today, there are problems with devaluation of labor, modern day forced labor, and the worst forms of child labor. So what's key here is that there's a creation of social inequality through cacao production and consumption that has foundation in pre-Columbian systems of labor, in which lords, this image here is showing a Maya lord demanding tribute and services, and the lord is being paid in cotton textiles and in cacao. And so cacao production was a way to satisfy these sort of tax obligations of citizenship. And then the labor seems to have involved all of the household, men, women, and children. And consuming cacao for elite people was a way to display their power and wealth. So now I'll do a little, give you a little bit of background. The earliest, so far, the earliest evidence of cacao consumption, you know, anywhere in the Americas, comes from Ecuador. And here's an example of a vessel that has the chemical traces of having had a cacao beverage inside of it. And this dates to about 1200 BCE. So very ancient. They also found in related contexts the cacao seeds themselves in a burial, in a tomb. But this sort of, and you'll notice on this slide, so that's in sort of Ecuador and into Venezuela. It occurs very early, and it very quickly makes its way to Central America and Mexico, particularly Pacific coastal Mexico, and then in many areas across Central America. And the bottle on the left-hand side is very similar to the one I just showed you. And in both of them, they're definitely sort of mimicking the shape of that cacao pod. They're referring back to it, or in the earlier example, it had actual pods hanging off the vessel. So, but there's a shift in the kind of form that the vessels that archaeologists have identified to have cacao residues in them to change. So what do I mean? You have a tall necked bottle, and then it shifts to something with an upright spout and a big opening at the top, and sometimes even a handle like the one on the right. And that, to me, as an archaeologist, says they're changing the way that they're preparing and serving this cacao beverage. And the one on the left, that sort of tall neck bottle, is not necessarily something that you would drink a brewed beverage out of. It's more like what you would drink a fermented beverage out of. So you could think of the fruit maybe being used as a wine, but that fermentation that might have happened to create the cacao wine would also be something that would make the seeds consumable and have more flavor, which then could sort of set the stage for a cacao beverage that would be maybe hot or cold, but definitely these sort of teapot looking vessels are something that would be good for sharing with multiple people, and it's a different sort of preparation is the key thing. So the evidence of cacao seeds, as well as depictions of tribute ceremonies, like I just showed you, indicate that pre-Columbian cacao was a wealth item, and that use and meaning intensified even more not long before European contact, so in the 1400s and 1500s. And so another important, I've emphasized so far consuming as a beverage or potentially as a food for cacao, but it's really clear at this moment before sort of global knowledge about cacao is that it was also being circulated as currency. And so it was literally, those seeds were wealth. It was small coin to have transactions in marketplaces, to buy things like eggs or corn or other foods or even services. And so using cacao seeds in those ways as a money indicates that there's a certain level of money supply that's consistent and that people can rely on to make it sort of feasible to have a money-based market kind of economy. And at the same time, the way people consume cacao, both as money and in foods and beverages, was a kind of badge of identity. So I very much, and I'm going to show you a couple of examples of where people of Mexico and Central America had this sense of terroir, or the unique flavors and quality associated with the way the cacao was produced, and sort of genetics, climate, and place, all of those things that affected flavor come into play for Mesoamericans. So, and I've done this survey of pre-Columbian inscriptions that describe cacao in different ways, in different qualities of cacao. And then I did some sort of mapping of those descriptions that I'll show you here in just a second. So one example that I have here is the text that reads cherry cacao. So you might have heard, before Europeans found out about cacao, it was all bitter or spicy. Well, that's not exactly true. So here's an example of kind of a fruity and definitely sweet. There are some other references in these readable pre-Columbian texts. And so these inscriptions that I'm showing you date to about the 6th or 7th century AD, so of the Common Era. So sakha is a kind of a cold drink that people use for ceremonial purposes, and it has a lot of corn and a little bit of cacao in it. And then this kakawaul is a kind of atole, and it also kind of a thicker corn-based drink, but it has a lot of cacao in it. So much more. So it varied in the amount that might be in a food or drink. And there are other inscriptions that describe thick sort of almost like stews and things that had cacao in it. So a real array, a culinary quilt, if you will, of cacao related foods and drinks. And so what I did, and these are all Maya terms here, is I sort of mapped out the frequency of different terms, and then the color coding is something to sort of call your attention to a couple of main categories that they fall into. So the yellow towards the top is fruity or sweet. So almost half of them are fruity or sweet kind of descriptions, which again goes against that common narrative of it being bitter and spicy. The tiny little red slice to the left a bit, that's the only reference in my inscriptions for chili pepper. And then the green is referring to corn in one way or the other. And so, or corn-based recipes. And so you can see a real association of corn with cacao. And then on the kind of brownish slice to the right, those are other kinds of ingredients or sort of the quality of the cacao that is especially notable. So ripe. And also, again, this is sort of, I have it up next to the fruity part, the utal and the yellow, because it's also describing sweetness in many cases. So that's sort of the vast array of these pre-Columbian inscriptions in describing cacao. And then what I did is I mapped it where those inscriptions occurred to see sort of the degree to which they're similar from one place to the next. And the bottom line with a sort of all these pie charts and all these different colors is that it really varied tremendously from place to place, which kinds of cacao terms they were using and the sort of overall palette of flavors that each region in this ancient Maya world that they were interested in and bothering to write an inscription about. So also, so that you know, those were ancient Maya examples. And then I have done a lot of work with sort of archival sources and looking at the same kind of, you know, do they describe things in different ways? Do there seem to be local recipes? And sure enough, these are just a couple of examples from 1570 vocabulary that describe different cacao beverages. And what I want you to pay attention to here is that they're always translated as cacao beverage. There's a word I have not said yet, and that word is chocolate. So if you think about Mexico and Central America having this vast array of different kinds of recipes and a lot of variation from one place to the next and what they call it and how they make it, there are lots and lots of local recipes. And the special local recipe that had the name of chocolate comes from one place, not across Mexico and Central America, but this region that includes this Izalcos region of what is today Western El Salvador. And this sort of poem that is in this inscription that was written in a letter that dated to 1579 that uses that word chocolate, and that it refers to you see many of these elements of from my dowry. So this is from somebody's wealth that they're going to give at their daughter's wedding. So I'm bringing you my wealth in a gourd. And so it's a gourd vessel that is a tecomate. It's a specific shape, and that's the one that's in the black box in the center. It's this sort of rounded shape. So it's a very specific vessel shape that is cacao and achiote. Achiote is another plant that kind of grows in that cacao environment. Today, you might have heard of it as annatto. It's used for coloring food. That it's a natural plant, sort of. It has a very red color, and that's how they make chocolate. And so this is one of the first colonial examples of the word chocolate used anywhere. So not only is the vessel, like the cup that people served the cacao beverages in, special, there were other tools that were important for making the specific preparation. And for chocolate, it was important to froth it, to stir it. And so when you think about those very ancient teapot kind of shapes to the ceramics, there was a hole big enough that you could introduce a stirring stick like this, a molinillo. So you have the spouted pot, a steep-sided cup, and stirring or frothing. And on the right, it shows a woman pouring from a great height into a special cup, and she is making chocolate. So it really sets this beverage, this food, this substance apart from all others. So chocolate kind of created a certain distinction, and in the material world as well. So how you make it, how you prepare it, what you serve it in, all of that was very special for cacao foods and beverages. So in the 16th century, when Spaniards came into this region of Mexico and Central America, they start to appropriate and kind of move in that territory of chocolate consumption and production. And at the beginning, chocolate especially was kind of a hard sell as a food item. And the Spanish first adopt cacao quite readily as currency. So they use it as legal tender immediately. It's small coin for transactions, which the Spanish were really having trouble with at the time. And so they adopt it as this sort of wealth money item, and then learn to appreciate cacao foods and drinks. And that European use of cacao as a wealth item continued well into the 18th century, with cacao, solid chocolate, and chocolate relating serving vessels inherited as wealth and recorded in probate records. And so the kinds of things you see in the painting on the right of those cups and the chocolate pots and serving items, those all would have been colonial wealth items. By the 1600s, chocolate was part of a trio of beverages. And Anne, I noticed on your wall behind you, you had a sign about coffee. Each of these beverages was from a different world region. So coffee, tea, and chocolate, and it transformed life globally, really. My survey of early colonial cacao beverage recipes shows that Europeans sort of translated it into their world, into their food system, by adopting flavors like sesame, almond, and sugar. And remember, Mesoamericans already appreciated sweetness with cacao. And so in my survey of sort of colonial recipes, I looked at early recipes of what they recorded as Guatemalan chocolate. And you can see here, to me, that shows the early adoption of European items of sugar and almond milk and some things like that. So so indigenous people are thinking about it, adopting it, European substances to sort of tinker with chocolate as much as it goes the other way. And and at the same time period and kind of the same kind of survey of looking at flavor profiles. Here's an example of British colonial cacao or chocolate recipes. And you can see a lot of infusion of other sorts of flavoring. So you have spiciness. So there are peppers and chili peppers, but also things like nutmeg, clove, and cinnamon. A lot of floral elements that, in addition to the American vanilla, which was something they learned from Mesoamericans, you have orange flower, anise, things like that. The use of milk, and British recipes are kind of unusual for including the sort of citrus, lemon particularly, as well as these kind of umami, musky flavorings. In contrast, does this look like the British profile? No, it's quite different. The French recipes of the same time period have much more of an emphasis on sort of floral additives and descriptions, a little bit of that muskiness, but not as much as British, and then a fair bit of spiciness, and nuts and so forth. And then at the same time, this looks different yet again. And what you really see is far more in Spanish recipes, a lot more nuts and seeds, which I feel like is a sort of mirror to the Mesoamerican emphasis of corn and corn sort of flavorings and qualities. For Spanish recipes, it's more spiciness and then that kind of smoothing out with nuts. And then, so that's overall surveys. And then I did a kind of family tree of individual recipes to see how they tracked with particular places and over time. And, oops, sorry. And what you see is that initial branch that goes down, like the founding generation, sort of on the left-hand side, are the Guatemalan recipes. And they're all very similar to each other. And then there's a big branching that occurs to the right that are European, especially French and Italian recipes. And then a sort of Mexican core over here. And then what the key thing with this sort of family tree is that the different regions of Europe sort out, different regions of Latin America sort out. And what it says to me is that they're, again, just like with the ancient Maya, you have it, they may be calling it chocolate, but it's going to taste really different from one place to the next. So what you can take from this is that Europeans really embrace cacao as a way to define distinct tastes. And some regions, here's another way to sort of see that same data as sort of global connections. And those thicker bands, thicker arrows are stronger, more in common from one region to the next. So some regions have more in common than others. And it's not just so to use the cacao to make chocolate requires a certain set of tools, a kind of technology. And just like those, the serving vessels of the upright spouted pots haven't changed a whole lot in hundreds of years, this technology has really not changed all that much. You would think that, oh, it's dramatically different with modern factories and so forth. And yeah, the scale might be different, but the basics of what the technology is and does is this, with a heated sort of grinding area that helps heat and cool the ground cacao and make it into a paste, and a press to extract the cocoa butter from the seeds. So as you make the paste, each cacao seed has quite a bit of cocoa butter in it, a lot of fat. And so there's a process of removing that and then only adding in a smaller portion of fat to suit the kind of taste and texture that you want. And here's another image of the grinding stones, and there's a little box you can see under there with this European man, French person, grinding the cacao seeds. It's again to heat that surface. And then those stirring sticks or molinillos, that becomes a distinctive part of European material culture. And then the serving vessels, basically they're taking those Mesoamerican forms and translating them into other materials. And so in this case, a very fancy silver chocolate pot that was part of the wealth of the first governor of Virginia. And he willed that to his family. And so in silver and in copper, here's an example in copper from the 18th century. And then the serving and how people consumed it, it creates this whole new sort of set of a particular shape and kind of cup in this fancy porcelain or refined white earthenwares that really set it off as a special kind of, in this case, very luxurious beverage to consume. And so this would not be mistaken for a teacup or a coffee cup. It's quite distinct. So this ready adoption by Europeans of the exotic tools, the method of serving, and the taste of chocolate isn't an accident. Separate, different. Chocolate was an object of desire for pleasure and for profit. But the moral dilemma was, how could colonizers embrace what was foreign and potentially corrupting? To colonize, though, meant to do exactly that, to take in, to integrate what's distant. And the name of one of many cacao drink recipes, Guatemala's chocolate, became synonymous with the commodity starting in 1580, when the price of cacao spikes. And this region, the Isalcos, are pretty much the only producers that are circulating cacao at that point, due to the devastation in other producing zones of disease and colonial disruption. And here's an example of the change in the price, and that 1580 spike is exactly when you start to see this word chocolate show up in lots of different places. Because of the Isalcos region's unsurpassed production of this source, they literally talked about where money grows on trees, as well as this really interesting, alluring comestible. Chocolate becomes this word of choice. Europeans learned to like chocolate because of their material dependence on Native Americans. But it was not because it was a curious food or drink. It was an engine of commerce, and at the same time, a way to proclaim social status and taste. Europeans depended on indigenous labor management for cacao. The Spanish were basically siphoning off wealth created by skills, knowledge, and experience of native residents. After the initial long 16th century reliance on a kind of a coerced labor system of taxes, or it's coerced taxing, and then kind of a shift to wage labor that those native cacao farmers did to compensate for losses due to disease and abuse. Cacao production shifts by about 1615 to new regions that had not been a place of huge production before. So that's Costa Rica, Venezuela, Ecuador. And those regions didn't have the same skilled, knowledgeable population that really focused on cacao farming like those other regions of Mexico and Central America. And then these orchards were on privately owned plantations, basically, that were worked by a new source of major labor, coerced enslaved Africans. The trend during the colonial period is for chocolate to become increasingly, even exclusively associated with sweet, dark foods. African enslavement sugar, and taste for sweetness mutually reinforced each other, creating new foodways regime that was predicated upon capitalism. While pre-Columbian evidence demonstrates that sweetened forms of cacao beverages and foods existed long before Europeans found chocolate. And in fact, I think Europeans learned to like sweetened versions by tasting them first in Mesoamerica. All American recipes were not dark and sweet, and that chocolate was rich, dark, bitter, and sweet related directly to its connection to racialized circumstances of labor, that it was wealth, and it was secured at a moral and social cost. From roughly 1500 and 1900, between 10 and 15 million enslaved Africans survived forced transport across the Atlantic and began working under chattel slavery, treated as a property, what the anthropologist Sidney Mentz called false commodities. Lucrative commodities like sugar and rum, coffee, tobacco, cotton, and cacao required intensive, skilled labor working under frequently strenuous conditions. The triangular Atlantic trade was the site of enormous wealth generation and botanical, demographic, and cultural change. Cacao, native to South America, was spread throughout the New World, Southeast Asia, and West and Central Africa for cultivation. Imperial powers came to rely on goods produced by enslaved laborers, implicating slavery directly in the development of capitalism and implicating global citizens in the system alike. Opposition to Atlantic chattel slavery always existed, and as enslavement became less financially viable and morally tolerated, abolition became gradually and slowly over a period of approximately 100 years. Once the system of slavery became apart at the seams, European powers worked to increase cacao production in other places with suitable climates and inexpensive labor sources, such as Sao Tome and Principe, West Africa's Gold Coast, and Indonesia. Exploitative labor practices continued in cacao and sugar production post-abolition, especially in West and Central Africa and the Caribbean. Cultural contact through colonial enslavement contributed directly to the shift in culture and taste among Europeans and others in relation to chocolate. These societal shifts in meaning were fundamentally linked to the dislocation of production, so those cacao farming areas, and consumption. And it's really staggeringly disparate, the amount of cacao or chocolate that's consumed in those producing areas versus where chocolate's consumed globally. And the transformation of this relationship between consumers and producers. The long-term perspective on the changing culture of chocolate consumption that I've laid out for you shows a trajectory of increasing permeation of chocolate into European foods and regionalization of taste in chocolate recipes. So they make chocolate their own. Over time, the development of local taste has been undermined by industrial manufacture of chocolate, which since the mid-1800s has transformed chocolate to an inexpensive cocoa powder to be drunk or a chocolate bar to be consumed as a food by elite and non-elite alike. The intersectional relationship of race, gender, and class has become further complicated by the factory work environment and the increasingly gendered representation of contemporary cacao farming. Advertisements, both historical and contemporary, also regularly gender and racialize chocolate. With these changes in chocolate production came massive changes in flavor and nutritional content as well, such that industrially manufactured chocolate and candy typify what scholars now call ultra-processed foods. Today, Europe is the world's biggest processor of cacao, 60% of the world total, as well as the largest per capita consumer of chocolate, about 50% of the world total. The average British citizen, for example, consumes about 7.5 kilos of chocolate a year. The US is slightly above that. And you can see that the Swiss top everybody out at 11.6 kilos per person, average. Today's largest companies colloquially known as the Big Five, Nestle, Mars, Cadbury, which is now owned by Kraft, Hershey's, and Ferrero, all seek consumer brand loyalty. The West and Central African nations of Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Nigeria, and Cameroon collectively produce about 70% of the world's cacao today. The long-standing disjuncture between producers and consumers is highlighted by the consumption of producers. Even though Africa is the world's biggest producer of cacao, it's also the smallest per capita consumer of chocolate, just 3%. And farmers in West and Central Africa face many critical challenges. Perhaps the most well-known outside of the region is that of eliminating the worst forms of child labor. In an attempt to address the labor abuses and increase farmer yields to ensure a steady cacao supply chain, a variety of certification schemes, such as fair trade, and you've probably seen these labels, fair trade, Rainforest Alliance, and so forth, have really proliferated in cacao sourcing. And so that attracts a lot of consumer interest. Dissenting voices about certification, though, at the same time are kind of gaining volume, because they argue that the claims of fair trade are strikingly different than the results of the practice. And so I can go into more detail about that. So chocolate occupies this sort of uneasy place in people's diets today too, especially in light of growing rates of obesity and recent junk food taxes, particularly in Europe, that target foods high in salt, sugar, or fat. In response to this perceived loss of flavor and quality in industrial manufactured chocolate, beginning in the 1970s and 80s, an increasing number of bean-to-bar chocolate makers made a return to small-scale manufacturing, often using vintage machines and single-origin fine cacao. So when it says Dominican Republic cacao chocolate or Ghana chocolate, and sometimes it'll be down to the scale of a single farm. Companies like Valrhona, Bona, El Rey from Venezuela, Scharfenberger, attract high-end consumer interest by marketing their products as haute cuisine, crafted by skilled artisans with a focus on fine flavor. Now there are over 150 such companies operating in North America and an estimated 70 companies in Europe. And there's now a current trend for the producers to start making their own bars, which is an important development. But it all reflects this return to interest in terroir, the sense of place, and craft and quality. This renewed consumer interest in fine flavor, combined with the increased desire to avoid highly publicized problems of child slavery in chocolate, represents a local branding of a tropical product and attempts at compassionate consumerism. These craft chocolate company owners carefully source cacao from respected operations, even going so far as to highlight the post-harvest practices of the growers and to specify which genetic variety comes from which country of origin in their marketing materials. Single origin dark chocolate bars are made in elaborate molds and are often wrapped in ornate, colorful paper. So it's a whole package, so to speak, how it's produced and the way you receive it, that is this focus of such attention and detail. It really indicates its localness and indicates knowledge and some ethical control of the conditions of production. So this kind of critical analysis of the ancient history of cacao in Mesoamerica to the present day state of the chocolate industry and consumption shows how complex the cacao chocolate supply chain has always been, and its impact on the lived experiences of people throughout the world. It's quite possible that the fine and craft chocolate products, linked with sometimes dubious claims of ethics and quality, expand consumption far more than they meet the needs of the people they are ostensibly trying to help. Everyone is implicated in our contemporary food system, and everyone, from farmers to consumers, will be involved in creating solutions to its problems. Chocolate's capacity to connect at local and global levels tells us not only about past lives and about how we are right now, but how we could be. So thank you.
Excellent presentation today. I'll go ahead and ask the first question as I wait for things to come in. And so one of the many takeaways that I have from this presentation is the fragility of the environment needed to produce cacao, especially on the sort of smaller batch craft level. So I would imagine as an industry, climate change is a major topic. And how do you see that playing out in the future? How's the industry looking at that?
So there's a lot of energy focused on climate change, and it has real measurable effects, and they're not necessarily all negative, but they're definitely impactful. So this issue of water and access to water and reliable rainfall and so forth can make some good producing areas at the margins. At the same time, because of global warming, there are some regions that were too cold and inhospitable for cacao, and were often, places where crops like coffee were flourished. Now those are becoming not favorable for coffee, and the people are starting to shift to plant cacao there. So absolutely, climate there are lots of studies being done to sort of assess on this kind of year-to-year basis of shifts that are going to really impact the farming. And that thing that I didn't include in this description about the tree itself is that it's not an overnight tree that suddenly sprouts up and produces fruit. It takes about at least 8 years, 10 years with some varieties, some as long as 15 before they start producing. So thinking about climate change and thinking ahead to planning about how to manage cacao farming is really, it takes some vision. And so people are scrambling. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. I see a hand up from Gretchen in our Zoom audience.
Good morning, and thanks so much for this presentation. I have a couple of questions. First, you sort of skidded by the idea of fair trade, fair trade not being perhaps all we'd like to think it would be. I'd like to hear quite a bit more about that, because I kind of looked for that label. And the other thing is, I know in the Amazon there is one lodge where they focus on cocoa production, and I'm wondering about Amazonian production, because I don't know if your research is just Central American, Mexico focused, or if you maybe have some more South American focus.
Yeah, so definitely so I'll start with your second question first. And a major area of growth and sort of entry into the global market, and particularly the fine cacao market, is different regions in the Amazonian basin. So parts of Peru, parts of Bolivia, parts of Venezuela. And there's a lot of work being done in sort of re-encountering cacao that's gone a bit feral. And so it's seen as potentially ancient strands. Some of them were possibly introduced by Jesuit priests in some regions, because there's a certain amount of sort of development of cacao growing that was introduced in the colonial period, but definitely there are different varieties, different strains, different genetic strains that have been in that region for a really, really long time. And so People are very much interested in the potential for recapturing different qualities, different flavors of cacao, and sort of and working on that. So you'll see that in with different fine chocolate producers and working with farms, and particularly these tend to be smaller or cooperative groups, and so they're working at a farm by farm level and working to have more equitable sort of relationship with those smaller producers. Now, some of the issues about fair trade is that it is a good first place to look. And so if you're kind of doubtful, it's looking for those certifications is a way to sort of start to have informed consumption. But the issue is that those certifications are quite expensive, for one thing. And so cacao farmers that would very much like to participate in that simply can't because they don't have the resources. And yet they're working. So what you can also look for is direct relationships between those chocolate makers, wherever they are in the world, and the people growing the cacao. And that often is on the packaging, or it will be on the website for the chocolate maker, that they'll document what their relationships are like. And so in that direct relationship, there's much more of there's definitely a conversation going on at sort of at least a community or business level between those growers and those makers of chocolate, which is what you want, right, with fair trade. That's the fairness that we're looking for. And then the other thing that's a little bit problematic about some certifications is that they basically a distributor can buy shares, and they're buying cacao from consolidated sources. So it basically is coming in from lots of different farms, and then they have so many shares, and they can say, well, I can apply it to this batch that I'm buying and call it fair trade. Now, is that fair trade? I'm not sure it's doing what the fairness that we want from it. So it's tricky, and people are definitely trying to improve that whole system and make it more accessible, the certifications more accessible, and that they actually reflect what we hope they do.
I see that we have 5 questions from our live Friendly House audience, so I'll be like a game show host. And question number 1, come on down.
Hi, I enjoyed your talk. I actually had a comment and a question. The comment is that here in Portland, we do have a chocolate shop called Roast on 14th Street in Portland, where the owner brings in single sourced beans from various parts of the world, roasts them on site, does all of his own production, and it's a wonderful place to go. It's not cheap, but it's a wonderful place to go to get chocolate. Usually they have 2 or 3 different varieties from around the world where they've brought the beans in. The question I had mostly about Mesoamerican chocolate and this idea that chocolate was used in ancient Aztec rituals of human sacrifice, and that it was actually given to the people who were going to be sacrificed as sort of and I didn't know whether that's something that's just an urban legend or whether there is actually evidence for that.
So that one immediately, so yeah, absolutely. You have cacao seeds, and consuming chocolate is part of really important ceremonies. The particular issue of human sacrifice, like basically the sacrificial offering drinks a cup of chocolate and then is does his duty, so to speak, is not like, that's in all of the materials I've worked on and looked through, that is not at all a prominent element. So sacrificial victims, absolutely. And this is documented not just in central Mexico, where the main area for the Aztecs, but in this region of Western El Salvador, sacrificial victims would wear cacao seed necklaces. So that I think sometimes there's a bit of mistranslation or sort of making anything that says cacao into chocolate that happens. So no question whatsoever about the cacao seed necklaces and that being part of a sacrificial setting. But that kind of drinking this before you die, not so much. There could be an instance somewhere that I haven't read, but I try to go to these original 16th century sources or pre-Columbian sources, and in all of the depictions of various ceremonial scenes, that sort of the drinking of a frothed cacao beverage happens most at weddings. So
Sheila has had her hands up longest in our Zoom audience. Sheila, come on in.
Thank you very much for presentation. What is the scene behind you? First, I want to know.
Oh, this is the Isalcos. So it's this region of Western El Salvador. This volcano here is the Isalco volcano. And that whole area, like I did archaeological survey of every bit of that.
Thank you. Wow. Thank you. And the question I have for you is, do you have a comment to make about the recent announcement about the lead in chocolate, and another, I don't remember the name of the other element. Cadmium, yeah. So yeah. I started to become so self-conscious about the chocolate in my collection. Do I want to eat it? How do I know what's in it?
Yeah, so and I'm based right now in the UK, and they are especially, even more so than the United States, concerned about these potentially harmful elements that could be part of, it enters into the system, not in the processing, but in where it's grown itself. And so this area, as you might guess, is a volcanic area. And so there's a tendency, it's not even across all of, volcanic Latin America, but there is a tendency for certain metals to show up a bit more just because it's volcanic soils. Now, the issue is that that means that it's not evenly occurring in all chocolate that might be made from cacao from Latin America. And then there are other plants and I don't want to, worry you, but there are other plants that take up cadmium and lead even more than cacao does. To me, in some ways, I feel like cacao's been singled out as this sort of, special element. I want to say like poster child or something, when it's not necessarily fair. And if you look at the amounts that occur, it's very, very low. You would have to be consuming quite large amounts for it to have the kind of negative effects that we document medically. And then finally, you can think about the people who live in these regions, and all of their food, all of their water, everything is going to have these elevated levels, and yet they don't have astoundingly higher rates of the sorts of diseases that elevated cadmium tends to be associated with. So I think the research is maybe not deep enough and broad enough, and there's been a bit of there's another case too that's not cacao, that's quite similar in that in the US it's prohibited to consume tonka bean. And tonka is quite like vanilla in its taste and so forth, and grows in a similar circumstance. And Europeans love it. The French absolutely love tonka. And but it was in the 19th century where tonka got this bad rap in the US, and there were sort of other factors, economic factors at work that made Tonka rise to become a banned substance, and yet other people, other places consume it and don't seem to be having quite the medical problems we might worry about. So, not to say
Maybe-
that there you know, we should always be careful and thoughtful about anything we're consuming. But maybe these are a bit overblown or need more research.
Thank you.
I
Maybe
think you have permission to eat your chocolate now, Sheila. I saw Al Christian standing at the mic at the Friendly House. Al, come on in.
I'd like to question your assertion or your conclusion that that chocolate is a cultural thing. I remember reading in the New Scientist that there are 18 things in chocolate that would qualify as drugs by themselves, that the combination of fat and sugar in the same food is particularly addictive, that you can get rats, not humans rats don't have human culture, to walk across an electrically charged floor to get to highly processed sweet foods. And an article that came out in Nature just about a week ago that said once you've gained some weight by eating sweet foods, your brain is changed to crave those foods, and it can't get changed back. So isn't it possible perhaps that the culture has grown up to explain the addiction rather than as the cause of the addiction?
Yeah, well, I think they're mutually reinforcing, absolutely. And chocolate definitely has this reputation of being addictive, particularly addictive. If you like it, you love it, you crave it. And there are some sort of biochemical, responses that it is associated with rises in serotonin levels. So it gives you sort of that warm glow when you potentially when you consume it. And then also I would have you think about too, again, using the word chocolate masks a lot of variety. And if you look at an everyday, chocolate bar that's a typical chocolate bar, Hershey's bar or Cadbury's or whatever, it tends to only be about 10 or 12% cacao mass in it. That's the minimum standard for it to qualify as chocolate. So, and that other largely 90% is sugar. And so when people say they're addicted to chocolate, sometimes they are addicted to the sugar. But we have many more options now. And again, you can be thoughtful in that. If you consume something that's 40, 50%, that's a lot more. That's a lot more of the benefits and the kind of complex dietary elements that cacao and chocolate can bring into your diet. That maybe is more palatable, more appealing than other forms of those same substances, nutrients.
Hank Robb has very patiently had his hand up in our Zoom audience. Hank.
Thank you for your presentation. It was really very fascinating. I have lots of questions, but just first to follow up with the comment from the previous discussion, the health benefits of chocolate having been touted. I've tried some chocolate that's 80-something% chocolate, and I find that I'm very fond of sugar and butter fat.
Yeah.
But the second question is, what caused the price rise and collapse? Because if I saw the graph properly, there wasn't a big change in the availability of the.
No. Yeah. Exactly. So the supply was incredibly stable, and that supply I'm showing you is just out of the Isalco's region alone, and it was on the order of at least 1.2 billion cacao seeds being shipped out of one port. So it's the records for one port is that tremendous. And so if I put it in a broader context, colonial markets were extremely volatile. And so you have lots of ups and downs, but then there was it was kind of a sweet spot, a perfect storm, however you want to describe it, of the price having this spike, the availability being stable, and then consumer awareness, interest in consuming more, over a broader, more consumers, more broadly, in more kinds of settings. So it was an unusual sort of moment, and then it drops off because you start to have that very high yield production, plantation farming with enslaved labor in lots of different places that arise in Venezuela, Ecuador, Costa Rica, and they're big plantations that just really ramp up and get going. And they're growing a different variety of cacao that's very high yield, but at the time people complained, people in Guatemala, El Salvador, oh, this is lower quality. And so it's the same sort of debates that you hear today with industrial chocolate versus fine flavor cacao and chocolate, that you might sacrifice quality for very high production. So there are different dynamics going on that cause that drop off.
This is not quite the tulip phenomenon. In fact, supply greatly increased,
Yep.
which is the source of the drop.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's the tulip phenomenon was such a short, really short, almost single occurrence, and chocolate and cacao gain a kind of market share, and then all of these people entering into its supply that make it more consistent and kind of build into this multi-billion-dollar business today.